Welcome to episode 3 of Mental Health in the Age of the Metaverse. I'm your host, Christian Ulstrup, and every episode I sit down with a mental health professional to talk about technology, including virtual reality, cryptocurrency, social media, and the rapidly evolving internet landscape, and how technology impacts our mental health. My guest today is Joey Santos. Joey is a licensed professional counselor in Texas. He works with both adults and children and is researching the use of family therapy for management of ADHD as a part of his PhD program at Texas Wesleyan University. He has also been using virtual reality most recently in his clinical practice. Joey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here, Christian. Appreciate the invite.
Great to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
So I would love to start at the beginning. How did you decide to become a therapist?
Oh, wow. That brings me back. I think it started, if I'm being honest, in high school, like a guidance counselor. I went to this school where you link up with like a freshman when you're a senior. And you're supposed to be their like big brother kind of thing. And the guidance counselor like brought me in and told me like, hey, like some of your class, we're looking for like someone to be a big brother to this individual. He's I guess looking back probably dealt with somewhere on the spectrum. And we asked like your class leaders like who do you recommend like linking him up, and like apparently everyone said my name. And so that was like the first time I thought of myself as like someone who could relate to others, who was like super nice and empathetic, if that makes sense. And so honestly, like it was that combined with one of those tests that you take as far as like what your strengths are, came up as like a psychologist. So that really set me on the track to it.
Amazing. So it was meant to be.
I think it was. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so you've been a counselor for a little while now, and you're pursuing your PhD. It sounds like you're working on some really interesting research. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a counselor since 2013, at least in private practice, and working with male adolescents was my first, I guess, niche, so to speak, because I was younger at the time and a male counselor, and so I found myself getting stuck with them, or having to really like have these long treatments with them. And a couple of times randomly, the parents were in at the same time, and all of a sudden I started seeing these sparks fly when like both are able to talk, and there's this back and forth and these new understandings. And so that's what motivated me to learn about family therapy. And so I found a PhD program. I'm here in the Dallas area, and so there's a PhD in marriage and family therapy at Texas Wesleyan University in Fort Worth. And so just signed up and interviewed and got accepted. And so that's kind of what's led me down this path. And I'm very, very close to the end. Should be done in August. I'm finishing up my dissertation and doing family therapy with kids with ADHD, and looking at some cool stuff with that.
Excellent. So I've heard from other therapists, and certainly as somebody who was an adolescent boy at one point, I've heard that working with adolescent boys can be very difficult. Could you talk a little bit about maybe why that is, or what your experience has been?
Yeah, I think with the adolescent brain, it's one more delayed than the counterparts in the females, right? That frontal lobe of decision making and impulse control, and the emotional development. And so I think they're even less likely, adolescent boys, less likely to be okay with like even identifying like what their feelings, right? Like you could even say their feelings vocabulary isn't developed. So the feelings that they do know are what are the most obvious, which is like anger and like fear and things like that. And so it's hard for them to really understand like what they're feeling. And then honestly, if I'm being honest, I think there's that it's being deconstructed, I think, a little bit, but just the old world, I don't know if this would be a stereotype of this idea of like guys and males don't deal with their feelings. They just kind of like bootstrap every problem they have, and they don't talk about feelings. And so luckily in the last couple of decades, I think that's getting deconstructed a little bit, but I think there's probably still some, especially with, the parents and grandparents, there's still some of that puts some friction into why it might be a little challenging to work with adolescent males.
That makes a lot of sense. And also why, it would be important to bring the family into the room as well. So to that end, what have you noticed, or what have you learned in working in family therapy? You said it's been effective, and you're focused on management of ADHD in particular. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's I think you hit the nail on the head, Christian. Like I think it goes down to what messages they're being told from their parents and from the interactions. And this could be a whole nother podcast about what happens, the residual effects of ADHD. But when you're already noticing that things are a little different, we begin to make these assumptions about ourselves, and it can really get into our identities. And so what family therapy does, at least in how I'm viewing it, is it allows, at the very least, the parents insight into knowing how the kids are viewing themselves. And then it allows them to at least clear things up. Even if parents still are parents, and whatever ineffective things are happening, even if that continues, they can at least understand the impact on the identity. And so I think for me, family therapy, with my experience with family therapy, especially with ADHD, is one, they get an insight into how their kid is experiencing life. And it allows them to, let's say, instead of, oh, my kid's lazy or doesn't listen to me, understanding like, no, my kid can't really store very many things in their internal shelf, and already feels bad, and then allows them to really do things differently in the environment.
Makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I know we have parents who listen to this podcast, and certainly ADHD diagnoses are on the rise, and this is something I think that's top of mind for a lot of parents. So, you mentioned that helping them understand what their child's experience is like can be a good step in the right direction. What would you say to those parents who, maybe their kid recently got an ADHD diagnosis? What would you say to them to help them understand what that might be like?
I would say that, well, two things. One is when things are calm, there's a saying, strike when the iron's hot, right? In this situation, it would be strike when the iron's cold. What I tell parents, after all the problematic things that ADHD brings into the family, ask the kids, like, what goes through your mind? Like, what are you thinking about yourself after these things? And that's one way. I mean, you may not get anything, right? You may get the typical, like, I don't know, but asking that can give you some insight, instead of like, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Which is understandable, right? Like if a parent hasn't experienced ADHD, it doesn't make sense why they can only remember one out of the 5 things you said to bring downstairs, when your other kids, maybe who aren't bothered by ADHD, can remember all 5 of them. And it's understandable that parents would think like, well, they just don't listen to me, or they're being oppositional. But it's like a shelf, right? Like one of the biggest examples I try to communicate to parents, and I would encourage you listening, if you're a parent, is we have think of like this internal bookshelf in the front of our head. And someone who is not bothered by ADHD can put probably, 5 to 6 things on that shelf and remember it in a minute. Someone who is bothered by ADHD, be lucky if they remember one of those things. Just this internal shelf isn't there. It gets better for them, but when they're kids, it's even less. And so, understanding that it's not about your parenting, it's not about what you did wrong. It's just, it's about the way their brains function. I think that's one useful tip for parents, to just remember that. And it sometimes takes a little bit of the pressure off.
That's a great piece of advice. I think that's something I've heard is parents often feel, feel guilty, or what one of my earlier guests even described it as feeling some sense of shame. If their kid is struggling, and just, it's not their fault, right? It's about figuring out how do you meet them where they are, and, develop some of these understandings and techniques that you're talking about. So, one of the topics we like to talk about on this podcast, hence the title, is technology. And there has been a lot of talk about technology, ADHD. I think there are some common problematic behaviors sometimes with the use of screen-based media when it comes to kids who are learning how to manage ADHD. What have you seen in clinical practice when it comes to the role of technology and ADHD in kids and teens?
I am still, it seems like there's a still general focus or motivation to figure out how to manage the screen time. Even if someone's coming into my practice that let's just say it's unrelated to ADHD, it's just, anxiety or, cloud of depression or sadness that they've been dealing with, more than likely like screen time and sleep are probably going to be the discussed, even if it's not an original thing that they're coming into. And so, and with that, it's hard because of course, right, it's cliche, but every kid's different. And so, what I try to encourage families to figure out is when does screen time become problematic? What does that even look like? How do you know when screen time is problematic? Or the opposite, the days that you find yourself being like, oh, that man, he really managed the screen time well. Or like those are really the golden days. Figuring out what would be, how would you know that your kid is healthy having healthy screen time? Well, there's less problematic things, and trying to navigate that versus strict hours and guidelines, because they're ever evolving, right? Smartphone came in at 2007 and it just boomed, right? It just boomed, and there was no studies. And so there's a lot of kids that probably had way too much screen time. Now there's some studies saying, okay, well, it's not all bad. But I would say that one of the consistent things that I try to communicate is creating like this bedtime routine where like screen time there's enough delay from screen time to like the initiation of sleep. Some kids, it doesn't matter, right? Some kids are just completely fine with it, but for some it does. And so as far as like, what is usually being discussed in my sessions, it's usually something about like, well, what's the bedtime routine look like? And that's usually like a starting place if screen time is problematic for the kids.
And what's something for parents to look out for when it comes to looking for symptoms of unhealthy screen time use?
This is where it gets hard, because isolation, not wanting to come out of their room would be one, but then it's like, that's like a teenager, right? Like teenagers are doing that. So there is this balance, but certainly isolation, and certainly you as parents, you know your kid better than anybody. And so asking yourself, when you have seen your kid at their best, what does that look like? And then compare it to how he's doing or she is doing now, or they're doing now. And that can give you some clues. But the obvious ones would be, dropping grades, not really interested in and getting outside or doing, if they like to play sports or go fishing, they're not wanting to really do that anymore. And just really locked in the game room or their room. And I think they have apps that like track how much they're doing. So, if you see a big spike in that, that would be another idea to give you some clues. But really just if you see it impacting areas of their life, whatever it may be, their old interests, they're maybe not as talking as much. Those kind of give you some clues that maybe to check in with how their screen time is.
You mentioned isolation, and that's something that my co-founders and I, when we were growing up, we could all, I think, speak to different times where we weren't feeling so good, and so you disappear into a video game or an internet rabbit hole or something like that. It's an easy thing to do, I think, as a teenager, probably as an adult as well. And so there's the isolation effect, but then a lot of digital media, especially now, is very social, at least nominally, right? There is a relational component, and like all relationships offline, I would assume, some can be very good and some can be not so good. So when it comes to using digital media in a relational way, how do you think about that, discerning what can be healthy and unhealthy with your clients and maybe their families?
It's a great question, and something it's on, I think, a lot of our minds in the mental health field, because it certainly, we want like meaningful, positive connections for our kids, and for better or for worse, it is meaningful, positive connections can be made through these digital mediums. So, I hate to go back to it, but I would just say how you see them interacting with their friends or yourselves as the family is a great clue. And of course, asking them, like, it's just different, right? But maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it would be a lot easier to know when your kid just had some interactions with their friends. They'd either hang up the phone, the phone line wouldn't be there, or they'd come in from hanging out at the mall or something, right? And so you might be asking, like, hey, how things go? And it would give opportunity for them to be like, well, this person was like awful to me, right? Nowadays, it's almost like you have to make those check-ins intentionally with them, because they could be interacting with their friends and, get off a FaceTime call and then immediately start another task. Well, there's not that time even to see you, for you to see if their eyes are sad, or if their head is down, like something happened, for you to check in. So, checking in with how things are going with their friends, and even asking them if they'd be all right, if would they even come to you if there's something going on with their friends. That'd be at least right now, as I know, something that I would recommend, because there's no answer yet to how to separate like healthy social relational development on screen time versus problematic screen time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, like you said, in 2007, the iPhone came out, and now subsequently we've had just explosions of new technology, both in software and now in hardware, with VR headsets and whatever Apple's going to be announcing maybe later this year. We'll see. So certainly an interesting time to be raising kids, or to be a kid, trying to navigate this, what's good and what's bad. So we talked a little bit about some of the things to be concerned about. And then I know in your practice, you've experimented with some technology that I hope has played a positive role. So could you tell us a little bit about using virtual reality with your clients?
Yeah, of course. It's been fun. It's been fun to, and that's sometimes very weird for me to, especially at the beginning. It was like surreal. But the clients that at least one of the family members have some sort of like neurodivergence, whether it be like on the autism spectrum or ADHD. Those, I've seen some pretty, at least anecdotal, positive outcomes of that. And it's been it was unexpected. And in a weird way, and this, of course, I like how you preface that, because this kind of just goes counter to what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But in a weird way, I've seen connections be able to form, at least in the moment, in a way that I haven't been able to see them in person. So just a quick example, you have let's like 18-year-old kid, I guess. I know they're adults, but they're just still kids, right? With autism, right, on the autism spectrum. And then you have 12-year-old brother, and this 12-year-old brother doesn't understand why his older brother doesn't want to interact with them, or, says they'll hang out, but like they don't. And really starts to personalize, like, well, I guess I'm not a good brother. I guess I'm not a good a person. And in this face-to-face session, the brother would be like, no, that's not it. That's not it. But it was just, I could see, like, it didn't seem genuine. Right. And that's the relational component of autism. But when we were in this virtual space, and it was it was like the first version of it. So I would imagine it's only going to get better, but there was we were these like two blobs, right? And you had the brother, and you had the younger and older brother. And the brother said pretty much the same stuff. And the older brother, the blob, like, the eyes were blinking. And so it like looked like it looked like they were like eye contact, right? And and he was like, oh no, I do love you. It's just that there's sometimes that, this happens or that. And it was just it's hard, because they say it's hard to like put what's happening clinically that's different, but there's a different experience on my end that there's this like connection and maybe understanding by the little brother that, okay, like, it's not about me. And it's like the younger brother's language, like eye contact, like affection, something that with autism, it may be difficult. It was almost, you were able to do that in a virtual space. And the person who deals with autism, I don't know, I'd have to ask him, and I probably should. What was it about it? Did he feel safer being emotionally close to his younger brother in that virtual space? Like, and giving him like the little virtual hug, because he was using Oculus. So there's two like blobs, and you could see him like coming and trying to hug him. And it was a really cool experience. And so that was what really sparked this idea of, okay, there's definitely, at least in my view, some positive use in this space with VR.
Amazing. So there's hope for us yet.
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Excellent. Now you're on the front lines of what is increasingly referred to as the mental health crisis. It's now very much in the mainstream media. The New York Times is running a series of very good investigative pieces trying to understand what's going on across the country, and I think around the world. But you're on the front lines and have been for years, seeing it firsthand. What is a topic when it comes to mental health, and it could be with adults or children, just in general in your experience, that you think deserves more attention, but is not getting it quite yet?
That's a great question. The first thing that comes to my mind and is the art of mindfulness. Now that in itself is it's gotten a lot of attention over the years, mindfulness, meditation, things like that. And so, but what I think there's not enough being talked about is teaching mindfulness as a tool for healthy tech use, especially for preteens and teens. This skill of noticing yourself, like hooked in, and then like taking yourself out. And then even if it's 2 seconds later that you're hooked in again, noticing it and taking yourself out of whatever you're supposed to be doing. So that skill of like kind of like lassoing your attention, so to speak, if you think of like a little like, a spotlight, right? Tech wants you, right? You mentioned, we were talking earlier and you were talking about like, it's like the arms of like the CEO, the companies, right? Trying to like pull you in. It wants you. And the algorithm's got us hooked. It is, for better or for worse, it is what it is, right? There's some good stuff that came out of it. So we have to unlasso ourselves. We have to like release ourselves from the grips of the algorithms. And so in my view, you can do that by practicing just moving your attention back. And the frustrating thing is when you start, it's like every 3 seconds you're having to do it. And so to me, I think if we started talking about, okay, how do you train your attention? Then that opens up a lot of different doors as far as changing your environment, maybe things like that. There's timers and things like that. There's apps like I like this forest app, right? Like you build a tree unless you get up, go to another app, and then the tree dies. Like, oh, that's awesome. It's really good stuff. But eventually you can just say, okay, whatever. I don't care about the tree. So I would say, mindfulness, like that should be talked about as a way to help teens learn to manage their technology use, because it's not going anywhere either.
Absolutely. And this is something that's totally top of mind in the program that we launched recently. So we're trying to teach teens, starting with boys, but we're going to have girls groups soon too, around developing healthier tech habits. And one of the things that we ran into early on was, if you're trying to teach a young person how to take control of their attention, ultimately, and you kind of alluded with this with the apps, they have to be self-motivated, right? So these different tools can take you pretty far and they can teach you the basics, but you have to continue to get the reps in, make it part of your, day-to-day, moment by moment existence in some cases. And so just a very concrete example, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but if you've got, let's say, a 13-year-old boy who has been putting off his schoolwork, maybe even has been missing school because he's playing so much Fortnite or whatever the latest and greatest game is, and he knows on some level that this is not good, and maybe that being able to get better control of his attention would be a good thing. What would you ask him, or what would you say to him to get him motivated to take those steps himself?
Well, my answer is biased because I'm coming from a family systems theory framework. But what I would ask him would be, what can your parents do? What can the people around you do to help you figure this out? What do you think when you have more control, like you want, like you're saying you want, when you have more motivation, what's going on around you that helps facilitate that, is what I would ask him. And that's where I think the family component would come in. But sometimes kids know, like, well, yeah, if they're doing this and that, then it's easier for me, because it's important, I think, to remember that, especially with teenagers, they literally don't have the frontal lobe developed yet, right? And now they're saying it's like not till like 30. And so manipulation of the environment to help them is still something that's it's okay to do. It's important to do. But I think bringing them in to help you as a parent, right? If I'm a parent, to bringing them in to help us, like as a we thing, let's figure out how to make it easier for you. I think, from at least in my view, that would be one of the first things that I ask, or I would be curious about in a situation like that, where you have this disconnect, right, from the logical, I know I need to do this, from like the very like impulsive, like I don't know if it's emotional, but it's very like impulsive, like visceral, like automatic thinking type of reaction, which is, well, I don't want to do it because I want to continue the brain stimulation of whatever is going on with my tech.
That family component is so important, or that, taking that more holistic frame.
Mm-hmm.
There was I believe it was University of Wisconsin. There was a paper that was just published recently that shows, and this seems kind of obvious in retrospect, and you're just talking about this, that very specifically the technology habits that the parents have get passed directly to the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And you can draw a straight line between the kids having better or worse physical and mental health outcomes based on what the parents are doing.
Wow. It makes sense, doesn't it? All the other habits, if you open up, or if you grow up and your parents are going outside and like working out and active, then you're more likely to be active. If your parents, maybe not so much lately or in the last couple of decades, but smoking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if your parents said, don't smoke, this is awful. You see them, right? Monkey see, monkey do. I mean, it's just what we do as children. We look to our parents. So yeah, absolutely. It would be. And so it's hard, right? Then of course you put more pressure on yourself as a parent, like, oh my gosh, but we do everything else for them. It's hard. It's hard to navigate the tech use. But I guarantee you, and I can't guarantee anything, but I would suggest just experiment with it. If you're a parent listening to this, just experiment with just leaving your phone in the home office for like one afternoon. And yeah, you'd have to write down your recipe or print off the recipe, right? Or you'd have to figure out who you need to call first. But just experiment with leaving your phone in your office for like one afternoon, maybe a couple afternoons, and just see the difference it makes for yourself, first of all. But I'd be curious to see what your kids notice differently about those afternoons with that. Something I have to do. I leave my phone. I don't even have a teenager. I have a toddler and an 8-month-old. And I notice myself just, picking up my phone in my pocket while I'm trying to play with them. And that's not in line with what I want. And so I leave my phone in my home office, and when they get home, and sure enough, I found myself more grounded with them, and easier to kind of battle the automatic habit of taking your phone out when it's not with you.
I love it. I think that's a great spot to land on. It's a wonderful piece of practical advice. And in fact, that echoes very closely, sort of ironically, one of the software, I think he's a designer, but he's a bigwig in Silicon Valley. I believe his name is pronounced Nir Eyal. He wrote a book called Habit Forming Products, Hooked. It was all about, how they designed a lot of consumer software to get people to develop these habits, which can have significant downsides. And he wrote a follow-up book called Traction, which is about how do you start developing, cultivating healthy habits yourself. Because he had this exact experience where he was playing with one of his kids, and he realized instead of paying attention, to a question that they had asked, he was on his phone checking his email or something. Mm-hmm. So all starts with those really small habits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Excellent.
I agree.
All right. Well, Joey, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, of course.
Really enjoyed this discussion. I hope we can do another one.
Me too.
So let's tell everybody what you're up to. So you're on social, got your website. Are you taking new clients?
Yeah, I'm taking new clients. You have to be in Texas because of licensing stuff. But yeah, definitely am. But my social, my Twitter handle is at Santos III as in the third. So at JSANTOS III. And website is jsantoscounseling.com. And so those would be the best ways to get in contact with me for any reason. Not only just to like set up therapy or anything like that, but just any questions you guys might have about any of this stuff. I'd be happy to try to answer it and as best as I can for y'all.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like you've had some fantastic experiences that I think a lot of parents and kids and families holistically could benefit from. So again, that's at jsantosIII on Twitter and jsantoscounseling.com on the web. Joey, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you, Christian.
All right. We'll talk again soon.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.